The omitted age, the last captain who sailed past the ice wall. What he saw before the charts were recalled. In 1773, a British naval captain named James Cook became the first man to cross the Antarctic Circle. Over the next 3 years, he would sail more than 60,000 miles attempting to find the southern continent that every map of his era claimed existed. Cook never found land. What he found instead was a wall of ice that seemed to surround the entire known world, an ice barrier so massive, so impenetrable, that it stretched for tens of thousands of miles in every direction. Cook's logs describe ice cliffs rising 150 feet above the waterline, extending as far as the eye could see. He sailed along this barrier for 3 years, searching for a way through, and never found one. His journals contain over 400 separate measurements of the ice wall's dimensions. Every single one describes a vertical or near-vertical ice cliff, with no beaches, no slopes, no gradual transitions, just sheer frozen walls rising from the ocean like fortifications. Then, 70 years later, something strange happened. In 1843, Sir James Clark Ross led another expedition south. He claimed to have sailed through Cook's impassable ice wall and discovered open ocean beyond it. Within 2 decades, Ross's account became the accepted version of Antarctic geography, and within 50 years, Cook's original charts, the ones showing the continuous ice barrier, began disappearing from naval archives across Europe. Today, if you try to find Cook's original maps, most are listed as lost or destroyed. The few that survive are locked in private collections, rarely displayed, never discussed. This is the story of what Captain James Cook actually saw, why his discoveries threatened the emerging global economic order, and how an entire chapter of exploration history was systematically erased to protect the greatest territorial expansion in human history. If you're watching this, you're not here for surface-level history. You're here because something about the official narrative doesn't add up. Subscribe now, because what I'm about to show you doesn't just rewrite polar exploration. It exposes how cartography became the most powerful weapon of economic control ever deployed, and why the truth about Earth's southern boundary had to be buried. James Cook wasn't some rogue adventurer chasing myths. He was the British Admiralty's most trusted navigator, a man who had just spent 3 years mapping the Pacific with unprecedented accuracy. When the Admiralty selected him in 1772 to search for Terra Australis Incognita, the mythical southern continent, they gave him 2 ships, the Resolution and the Adventure, and instructions to sail as far south as possible. The mission was straightforward: prove or disprove the existence of the massive southern landmass that every major European power believed would contain untold riches. Geographers had been drawing this continent on maps for 200 years, showing it spanning from South America to Australia, covering nearly a quarter of the globe's surface. Cook's job was to find it, claim it for Britain, and secure England's position as the dominant global power. But Cook found something else entirely. On January 17th, 1773, Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle at 66 degrees 33 minutes south latitude. His log entry is matter of fact, almost unremarkable. But what happened next changed everything. Instead of finding open ocean leading to a southern continent, Cook encountered ice. Not pack ice, not icebergs. A continuous barrier of ice cliffs towering over his ships, blocking any passage south. Cook spent the next 3 years attempting to penetrate this barrier. He would sail east for hundreds of miles, searching for a break, a channel, any opening. He never found one. In December 1773, he wrote that he had sailed 10,000 miles along the ice wall without finding a passage through. His logs describe ice formations that seemed architecturally impossible. Vertical cliffs of ice rising 150 to 200 feet directly from the ocean, with no slope, no beach, no gradual transition from sea to ice, just sheer walls. And this ice extended in both directions as far as his crew could see from the crow's nest, creating what Cook described as an impenetrable frozen boundary. He sailed as far as 71 degrees south latitude before turning back, not because he wanted to, because the ice wall physically prevented him from going further. His journals make this clear. Cook returned to England in 1775 with detailed charts showing the continuous ice barrier. His report to the Admiralty was unambiguous. There was no southern continent accessible by sea. There was only ice forming what appeared to be a boundary around the known world. Cook calculated he had sailed more than 60,000 miles total during the expedition, and the ice wall had been present along nearly the entire southern perimeter of his voyage. His charts showed this ice barrier circling the globe, an unbroken ring of ice cliffs surrounding all known oceans. The Admiralty received his report, they filed his charts, and then they did something curious. They sent another expedition south in 1819, then another in 1820, then another in 1823, then another in 1831. Each one following Cook's route, each one encountering the same ice wall, each one returning with the same conclusion. There was no way through. Bellingshausen's 1820 expedition is particularly important because he was explicitly sent to verify Cook's observations. His report describes continuous ice cliffs matching Cook's descriptions exactly. Weddell's 1823 expedition managed to sail to 74 degrees south, but only by finding a temporary indentation in the ice wall, not by sailing through it. By 1835, 5 major expeditions had confirmed Cook's basic observation. The Antarctic was surrounded by massive ice barriers, and then came James Clark Ross. In 1839, Ross convinced the British Admiralty to fund one more expedition south. He had spent years in the Arctic, and he believed the Antarctic ice was seasonal. The Admiralty gave him 2 ships, Erebus and Terror, the same vessels that would later vanish in the Arctic. Ross departed England in 1839, sailed south, and 4 years later returned with an extraordinary claim. He had found a way through Cook's ice wall. He had discovered open ocean beyond the barrier. He had sailed into what he called the Ross Sea, and he had mapped previously unknown coastline. Ross's charts showed breaks in the ice, channels leading south, entire ocean basins that Cook somehow missed. The Admiralty embraced Ross's account immediately. His maps were published, distributed to every naval power in Europe, and within 10 years became the accepted truth. But here's the problem. Ross's charts directly contradict Cook's charts in multiple locations where Cook had charted continuous ice walls. Cook charted solid ice barriers between 65 and 70 degrees south in regions where Ross showed open water. Ross claimed he encountered pack ice and icebergs, but no continuous ice barriers. He described sailing through fields of broken ice, but never mentioned the sheer ice walls that Cook, Bellingshausen, Weddell and Biscoe had all documented. This isn't a minor discrepancy. This is Ross claiming that an ice formation the size of a continent had simply disappeared. And Ross's route only works if Cook's ice wall had completely vanished in the 70 years between expeditions. There is no geological mechanism that explains how a 150-foot ice wall circling the entire Southern Ocean could melt and reform on a 70-year cycle. Ice sheets of that scale take thousands of years to build. They don't disappear in decades. Modern glaciology confirms this. Antarctic ice shelves accumulate ice at roughly 1 to 3 meters per year. Building a 150-foot ice cliff takes 50 to 150 years minimum. The melting rate is far slower. Ice shelves retreat over centuries, not decades. We have continuous data on Antarctic ice shelves going back to 1900. In 120 years, the largest recorded collapse was Larsen B in 2002, which made global headlines precisely because it was so unusual. Ice shelves don't just vanish and reappear, so when Ross claims to have sailed through areas where Cook charted solid ice barriers just 70 years earlier, he's claiming something that violates basic glaciology. The discrepancy was obvious to contemporary navigators. Several captains who had sailed with Cook publicly questioned Ross's claims, but these objections were ignored. Because by 1843, something had changed. The economic incentive structure had shifted, and suddenly it became very important that Cook's ice wall didn't exist. Between Cook's expedition into 1773 and Ross's expedition in 1839, the global economy had transformed. The Industrial Revolution had created an insatiable demand for raw materials. Whaling had become one of the world's most profitable industries, and whale populations in the North Atlantic were collapsing. European powers needed new whaling grounds desperately. By 1840, the global whaling industry was worth over £10 million annually, and North Atlantic whale populations had been hunted to near extinction. Sperm whales had declined by an estimated 75% in traditional hunting grounds. Right whales were down nearly 90%. The whaling companies were facing a crisis. They had built an entire industrial infrastructure around whale oil for lamps, lubricants, and machinery, and they were running out of whales. The Antarctic represented the last untapped whaling frontier. Early explorers had reported seeing massive whale populations in southern ocean waters. Cook himself noted dense concentrations of whales along the ice barrier. If those whaling grounds could be accessed and exploited, the industry could continue for another century. But Cook's charts showed that accessing those waters would require navigating through an impassable ice wall. If Cook was right, those whale populations might as well not exist. The whaling companies couldn't reach them, and without access there was no profit. This created enormous economic pressure to find a way south. But if Ross was right, if the ice wall was actually just seasonal pack ice with navigable channels, then suddenly an entire continent became theoretically accessible. Territory could be claimed, resources could be extracted, the race for Antarctic exploration could begin. Ross's maps made that possible. Cook's maps did not. Within 20 years of Ross's return, the major European naval powers began systematically removing Cook's original ice wall charts from official archives. The reason given was standardization. But the pattern is revealing. Charts showing Ross's open passages were preserved. Charts showing Cook's continuous ice wall were recalled and destroyed. In 1854, the British Admiralty sent a circular to all Royal Navy libraries requesting the return of all Antarctic charts produced before 1840 for review and correction. The circular specifically mentioned Cook's charts as requiring updates based on recent surveys. Libraries across Europe complied. Most of Cook's charts never came back. The mechanism was bureaucratic, not dramatic. No one burned the maps in public squares. Instead, the Admiralty simply issued routine administrative requests for materials to be returned for archival review. Librarians dutifully boxed up the requested charts and sent them to London. The charts were received, logged and filed, and then they disappeared into the system. When researchers requested access decades later, they were told the materials had been lost, damaged or transferred to other institutions, but those other institutions had no record of receiving them. Archive catalogues from the 1850s list Cook's Antarctic charts as present in dozens of libraries. By 1880, those same catalogues show the charts as missing, with notations like withdrawn for revision or transferred to Admiralty custody. But the Admiralty's own records don't show what happened to them after transfer. This is how institutional suppression works, not through conspiracy. Through process, forms are filed, materials are logged, transfers are documented, and somewhere in that chain of custody, inconvenient evidence simply ceases to exist. No one person makes the decision to destroy the maps. The system itself ensures they don't survive. By 1870, the vast majority had vanished. Today, the British Library holds exactly 3 of Cook's original Antarctic charts from the 3-year voyage. 3 from an expedition that mapped more than 60,000 miles. The National Maritime Museum has 2. The Library of Congress has 1. A private collector in New Zealand reportedly has another 4, but they've never been made available for academic study. The rest are gone. And the official explanation is routine archival loss. But routine loss doesn't explain why Ross's maps from the same era survive in nearly complete sets, while Cook's maps were specifically targeted. Now here's where it gets even stranger. There, in 1897, the British Admiralty quietly issued a notice to all naval cartographers, instructing them to standardize Antarctic ice depictions using Ross's surveys as the baseline. Any maps showing continuous ice barriers were to be corrected or removed from circulation. The notice didn't mention Cook by name. It didn't have to. Cook's maps were the only major charts showing a continuous southern ice wall. This wasn't a scientific decision. It was a bureaucratic one. And it happened at the exact moment when European powers were carving up the last unclaimed territories on Earth. In 1895, just 2 years before the Admiralty notice, delegates from 11 nations met in London for the 6th International Geographical Congress. The primary topic was Antarctic exploration and territorial claims. Multiple delegates questioned the accessibility of the Antarctic interior. They referenced Cook's ice wall accounts. They asked whether substantial territorial claims could be justified if Cook's observations were accurate. Norwegian delegate Fridtjof Nansen argued that Cook's ice barrier reports should be taken seriously. French delegates questioned whether Ross's surveys alone constituted sufficient evidence to overturn Cook's findings. The debate lasted 3 days. The response from the British delegation was definitive. Cook's ice wall was an outdated observation based on limited technology and seasonal conditions. Modern steam-powered vessels, they claimed, had proven capable of navigating areas Cook found impassable. Ross's maps were cited as proof that the Antarctic coast was accessible at multiple points. But here's what they didn't mention. The modern expeditions they referenced had all encountered massive ice barriers closely matching Cook's descriptions. They had found temporary channels and seasonal openings, but none had disproved Cook's fundamental observation. The British delegation simply conflated finding occasional gaps with proving the ice wall didn't exist. And the other delegations accepted this because they all had the same economic interests. Norway wanted whaling rights, France wanted territorial claims, Germany wanted research stations. Everyone at that conference benefited from declaring Antarctica accessible. No one benefited from taking Cook's ice wall seriously. No one mentioned that Ross's maps contradicted not just Cook, but also Bellingshausen, Weddell, and Biscoe. The conference concluded that Antarctica was accessible, claimable, and economically viable. And the race for territorial claims began immediately. Between 1895 and 1920, 7 nations formally claimed sections of Antarctic territory. Britain, Norway, France, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina all drew lines on maps, dividing up a continent that, according to Cook, was surrounded by an impassable ice wall. These weren't symbolic claims, they were backed by substantial economic interests. Whaling companies operating in Antarctic waters needed legal frameworks to protect their investments. Territorial claims provided that framework. Britain claimed over 1.7 million square kilometres based on Ross's 1841 expedition. Norway claimed territories based on whaling operations active since the 1890s. Each claim was justified by the same logic. Our explorers got there first. Our ships can navigate the region, therefore we own it. But this logic only works if the region is actually navigable. If Cook's ice wall still existed as he described it, these claims would be absurd. You can't claim sovereignty over territory you can't physically access. So Cook's ice wall had to be wrong, and the maps had to be corrected. Now here's the question that breaks the official narrative. If Ross actually found passages through the ice wall, why did subsequent expeditions continue to report ice barriers? In 1901, Robert Falcon Scott led the Discovery expedition to Antarctica. His logs describe continuous ice shelves blocking southern passage, far more difficult to navigate than Ross's charts indicated. Scott's journals reference ice formations matching Cook's descriptions rather than Ross's. On January 9, 1902, Scott wrote that the ice shelf ahead appeared to extend indefinitely in both directions, with vertical faces rising 100 to 200 feet from the water. This matches Cook's observations exactly. In 1911, Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole, but his route required crossing ice barriers that Ross's map suggested shouldn't exist. Amundsen's diary describes navigating through what he called the Devil's Ballroom, ice formations that appeared ancient and permanent. His team only succeeded because they found a single navigable route through what was otherwise an impassable barrier. This isn't the open, accessible Antarctica that Ross depicted. This is an ice-locked continent with a few exploitable weak points. Douglas Mawson's 1911 expedition reported ice walls along sections of coast that Ross had charted as open water. Mawson's logs identify specific discrepancies between Ross's charts and observed conditions. He wrote to the Royal Geographical Society questioning whether Ross's charts should be considered reliable for navigation. The Society told him Ross's charts remained the authoritative standard. Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance was crushed by ice in the Weddell Sea in 1915, a region Ross's map showed as seasonally accessible. Shackleton's account notes the ice conditions were far more severe than his charts indicated. The discrepancies pile up. Every major expedition between 1900 and 1950 encountered ice conditions that more closely matched Cook's descriptions than Ross's, but none of them said so explicitly, because by then the economic infrastructure of Antarctic exploitation was already in place. Whaling stations had been built, territorial claims had been formalized, international treaties had been signed. Questioning the navigability of Antarctic waters would have undermined billions in economic activity. So the expeditions reported their findings in technical language, buried the contradictions in appendices, and moved on, The conspiracy isn't that the ice wall exists and everyone's lying about it. The conspiracy is that Cook's observations were economically inconvenient, so they were erased from the historical record and replaced with a more commercially useful version of Antarctic geography. This isn't speculation. We have the paper trail, the Admiralty's 1854 circular requesting return of pre-1840 Antarctic charts, the 1897 notice mandating Ross-based standardization for all Antarctic cartography, the 1895 Geographical Conference prioritizing territorial claims over navigational accuracy, the systematic disappearance of Cook's charts from public archives between 1850 and 1900, while Ross's charts were preserved and widely distributed, the discrepancies between Ross's maps and every subsequent expedition's actual ice observations. These are documented facts, not theories, not speculation. The National Archives at Kew hold the Admiralty correspondence, the Scott Polar Research Institute holds the expedition journals, the Royal Geographical Society holds the conference proceedings. Anyone can request access. The evidence isn't hidden, it's just buried under a century of accepted narrative that nobody bothers to question. When was the last time someone compared Cook's original charts with Ross's charts and asked why they contradict each other? When was the last time anyone checked whether the Admiralty's map recall program affected Cook's charts more than others? The research hasn't been done because the questions haven't been asked, and the questions haven't been asked because everyone assumes the experts already checked. But they didn't, they just accepted Ross's version because it was more useful. What we're looking at isn't a flat earth cover-up, it's something much more mundane and much more insidious. It's the deliberate manipulation of cartographic evidence to justify economic expansion into regions that early explorers had declared inaccessible. And it worked because most people never look at the original sources. They trust the official version. They assume that if Antarctica is on the map, it must be reachable. But Cook said it wasn't, and his maps disappeared because saying so threatened the empire. Now let's talk about what actually happened to Cook's ice wall, because it didn't just vanish. The ice barrier Cook described in 1773 is still there. We call it the Antarctic ice shelf. Satellite imagery confirms that Antarctica is surrounded by massive ice formations, many of which rise 150 feet or more above sea level, exactly as Cook described. The Ross Ice Shelf alone covers roughly 487,000 square kilometres and forms vertical ice cliffs along its northern edge, with heights averaging 130 feet. This matches Cook's observations precisely. Modern glaciology confirms these ice shelves are incredibly stable, with core samples showing ice layers dating back over 10,000 years. Cook wasn't wrong, he was describing real geography. What Ross did was find seasonal breaks in the ice shelf, narrow channels that open during certain months, allowing limited access to the coast. These channels exist. Modern expeditions use them, but calling them proof that Cook's ice wall doesn't exist is like finding a door in a wall and claiming the wall was never there. The ice barrier is real, it's just not impenetrable year-round at every point. But that nuance didn't serve the narrative that Antarctic resources were freely accessible. So the nuance was erased and Ross's version became the official truth. The implications of this go far beyond polar exploration. What we're seeing is how economic incentives shape accepted history. Cook's maps threatened imperial expansion, so they were disappeared. Ross's maps enabled it, so they were enshrined. And the same pattern repeats across every era of colonial cartography. Maps aren't neutral documents. They're political instruments. Cook's ice wall is just one example. But it's a perfect example, because it shows how even empirical observations by trusted navigators can be systematically erased when they conflict with economic agendas. Cook sailed 60,000 miles and reported an impassable ice barrier. Ross sailed a fraction of that distance, found a few seasonal gaps, and his version became reality. Not because his observations were more accurate, but because his conclusions were more useful. So what does this mean for us now? It means we should ask what other inconvenient maps have been disappeared, what other explorers reported findings that didn't align with imperial ambitions and had their records quietly removed from history. Cook's charts survived by accident in a handful of private collections. How many others didn't survive at all? And how much of what we think we know about world geography is based not on empirical observation, but on economically convenient revisions of earlier, more accurate maps? These aren't abstract questions. They're foundational. Because if the basic geography of the Earth's southern boundary was falsified to enable whaling and territorial claims, what else was rewritten? The same pattern appears throughout the colonial era. Pre-colonial maps of Africa showing sophisticated indigenous trade routes and political boundaries mysteriously disappeared from European archives after the Berlin Conference of 1884, which carved up the continent among European powers. Those maps would have shown that African societies were far more organized and territorially defined than the civilizing mission narrative required. Spanish colonial maps of South America from the 1500s showing extensive Incan infrastructure networks were systematically replaced with maps depicting empty wilderness waiting to be settled. Portuguese maps of the Indian Ocean trade networks from the 1400s, which showed Arab and Indian merchants controlling vast commercial empires, were buried in favor of maps presenting European explorers as discoverers of virgin territories. The British East India Company's early surveys of the Indian subcontinent contained detailed documentation of existing property rights and administrative systems. These surveys were classified and replaced with maps showing India as fragmented and ungovernable, justifying direct British rule. In every case, the pattern is identical. Accurate maps that documented existing political, economic, or geographical realities were suppressed when those realities conflicted with colonial ambitions. Replacement maps were created that justified the desired imperial action. The originals were recalled, reclassified, or destroyed, and within a generation the replacement version became accepted truth. Cook's ice wall isn't unique. It's just the most thoroughly documented example of a process that shaped global geography for 3 centuries. And if they did it to Cook's maps, they've done it to others. The only question is which ones, and whether we'll ever get to see what was erased. This is the story they didn't teach you, this is the map they didn't want you to see. And if you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who questions official narratives. The next video breaks down how the same cartographic manipulation shaped the colonization of Africa, and why pre-colonial maps of the continent were systematically destroyed. Click it now, I'll see you there.